The hushed industry of the office building floor with too many cubicles was a balm to me, a sanctuary of ordered lines and predictable angles. Here, amidst the low thrum of ventilation and the muted clatter of distant keyboards, my world was exact. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of ink and parchment, traced the contours of an 18th-century trade route, a silk thread spun across a parchment sea. Each stroke was a whisper of history, a resurrected journey. I was Reid, and precision was the marrow of my bones, the very breath of my being. The scent of aged paper and drafting ink clung to my workspace like a comforting shroud. My tools, a brass compass, its needle a steadfast sentinel, a set of fine-tipped pens, each loaded with its specific hue, a magnifying glass, rimmed with tarnished silver, lay arranged with an almost ritualistic care. I found solace in the meticulous recreation of forgotten geographies, in the patient deciphering of faded script, in the act of bringing the land's forgotten arteries back to vibrant life. The world outside, a chaotic canvas of shifting boundaries and blurred truths, held little appeal. My universe was one of fixed points, verifiable depths, and legible legends. Then, a sudden, sharp interruption, the ring of my personal line, a sound rarely heard amidst the general office hum. My hand, poised to ink a particularly challenging coastal curve, faltered. The solicitor's voice, thin and reedy through the receiver, spoke of distant kin, of a legacy I hadn't known existed. An ancestral estate, miles from any recognizable landmark, decaying and remote, was now mine. My great-aunt, a name I barely recalled, had passed. The news settled on me, a fine layer of unexpected dust. The orderly lines of my current map seemed to waver, blurred by an encroaching, unfamiliar reality. A week later, I found myself standing before the wrought iron gates of the estate, their intricate lacework consumed by rust and grasping ivy. The air here was different, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The house itself loomed, a skeletal sentinel against a bruised sky, its windows like vacant eyes. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through skeletal trees and the mournful creak of unseen timbers. This was not the quiet hum of my cubicle, but a vast, consuming emptiness. Inside, the chill was immediate, bone-deep. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating a landscape of draped furniture and forgotten lives. The estate was a mausoleum of memory, a vast, decaying archive. My initial task, self-appointed, was to simply catalog, to bring order to this inherited chaos. It was in a small, seldom-used study, tucked away behind a library of crumbling spines, that I found it. The air in that room was heavy, stagnant, tasting of mildew and something metallic, like old pennies. A forgotten chest, bound in iron straps and smelling faintly of cedar and something indescribably ancient, sat beneath a grimy, leaded window. With a grunt, I forced the stiff latch, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Inside, beneath layers of brittle linens and yellowed correspondences, lay the map. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Not parchment, but a material I couldn't immediately identify, thick, fibrous, with a subtle, almost leathery sheen that seemed to absorb the meager light. Its edges were ragged, uneven, as if torn from a larger whole, yet the lines themselves were impossibly fine, etched with an almost supernatural precision. The ink was a deep, unsettling sepia, bleeding into the fibers in places, creating a mottled, organic texture. The map depicted the estate, yes, but not as I had seen it, nor as any conventional surveyor might render it. Roads I knew existed were absent, replaced by sinuous, unmarked paths that snaked through dense, nameless woods. But it was the symbols that truly snagged my breath. Not the neat compass roses or allegorical figures of historical cartography, but something far older, far more primal. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, not like designs that pulsed with an implied, unsettling energy. They were scattered across the map's surface, particularly concentrated around the unexplained features, like an ancient language struggling to articulate a terrible secret. And it was incomplete. A vast, jagged tear ran across its bottom edge, severing crucial information, leaving the most intriguing sections unresolved. It was as if a vital piece of a monstrous puzzle had been ripped away, deliberately withheld. My cartographer's instinct, that deep-seated need for completion and verification, ignited. The air in the study seemed to grow heavier, pressing in, and the faint, metallic scent intensified, now almost tasting of rust and something else, something vaguely saline, like tears. I held the map, its strange texture cool beneath my fingertips, and felt the weight of something ancient, something malevolent, stirring just beneath the surface of the land it depicted. The estate, I realized, held more than just forgotten memories. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of ink on vellum, now navigated the digital expanse of topographic surveys and cadastral plots. I had spent days trying to reconcile the old family map with the latest satellite imagery, dragging the antique parchment, with its unsettlingly precise lines and curious, unlabeled voids, into the present. The map, an inheritance as much as the estate itself, was a constant, irritating presence. Its intricate detail was a cartographer's dream, yet its omissions were a torment. Entire sections of the property, particularly those beyond the immediate manor grounds, were either blank or marked with symbols I couldn't decipher. More troubling were the faint, almost erased lines that suggested structures where no modern record indicated any. My attempts to overlay it with contemporary surveys yielded only frustration. The contours shifted, the boundaries blurred, and certain features simply did not align. It was as if the land itself had rearranged itself, or, more likely, the old map was a record of something deeper, something lost. "Are you still trying to solve that puzzle?" Reid, a colleague, whose desk sat opposite mine, inquired with a sympathetic smile, his gaze briefly flickering to the rolled parchment beside my monitor. "It's more than a puzzle," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. "It's a contradiction. A ghost of a landscape." My meticulous nature demanded resolution. The only way to truly verify the discrepancies was to walk the land, to feel the earth beneath my boots and measure the distances with my own tools. The estate, a decaying testament to generations of my lineage, beckoned with a silent, insistent pull. The drive was long, a slow unwinding from the structured grid of the city to the winding, shadowed lanes that led to the estate. When I finally arrived, the manor house loomed, a skeletal hand grasping at the gray sky, its windows like vacant eyes. But it was the surrounding land that truly held my focus. I began my exploration immediately, the old map clutched in one hand, a compass and measuring tape in the other. My first objective was a cluster of ancient oaks marked with an indecipherable glyph on the parchment. According to the modern deeds, this area was simply undeveloped woodland. Yet, as I pushed through the tangled undergrowth, the air grew strangely still, the usual forest sounds, the chirping of unseen birds, the rustle of small creatures seemed to recede. It was as if I had stepped into a different season, or perhaps, a different time. They clung to the gnarled trunks of the oaks, pulling at their roots with an unnerving intensity, even where the sun should have pierced through the thinning canopy. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, the sensation of unseen eyes tracking my progress. My cartographer's logic, usually so robust, began to fray at the edges. Then I saw them. Half swallowed by decades of ivy and thorny brambles, a series of low, crumbling stone walls emerged from the earth. They were not marked on any modern survey, nor were they mentioned in any property inventory I had reviewed. Their construction was rough, predating the manor itself, built from local fieldstone that had turned a mottled gray-green with age. These overgrown structures, barely discernible beneath the encroaching vegetation, formed an irregular, concentric pattern that made no architectural sense. They seemed to delineate nothing, enclose nothing. They simply were. I consulted the old map again. Faint, almost invisible lines on the parchment seemed to correspond to these crumbling ruins, hinting at a purpose long forgotten. The glyph on the map, once abstract, now seemed to mirror the irregular curves of the unearthed walls. They were rough-hewn, unadorned monoliths, perhaps 3 feet high, pushed into the earth at irregular intervals. They were not boundary stones, nor did they appear to be memorials. Their placement defied any logical pattern a surveyor, or even a landscape architect, would employ. They seemed to have been dropped haphazardly, yet their presence felt deliberate, a silent, cryptic declaration. My breath caught in my throat. My determination, usually a steadfast anchor, began to waver, replaced by a nascent unease. The estate was not merely decaying, it was actively concealing, pushing back against my attempts to understand its true contours. The map was not incomplete, it was a key, slowly unlocking a landscape that defied logic and pulsed with a quiet, ancient malevolence. And I, Reid, the cartographer of order, had just begun to scratch at its surface. The drone of the ventilation system was a familiar, dull comfort, a counterpoint to the insistent pull of the estate that still hummed beneath my skin. The inherited map lay rolled beside my current assignment, its edges subtly curled, a silent accusation. My fingers, stained faintly with graphite, traced the contours of an ancient Roman road on my desk, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange, incomplete chart. A flicker at the edge of my vision. A quick, formless shift of shadow against the pale partition of a distant cubicle. I blinked, turning my head sharply. Nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unwavering intensity, casting the same stark, unforgiving glow over everything. It must be fatigue, I reasoned, the late nights spent poring over the estate's convoluted history, the sheer weight of generations pressing down. The estate had a way of seeping into the mind, even when miles away. I tried to focus, to lose myself in the comforting geometry of old-world maps. The air, usually stagnant and predictable, seemed to thicken, a subtle shift in its texture. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past my ear, like dry leaves skittering across a stone path. I froze, pen hovering over parchment. It was too soft to be a colleague's conversation, too close to be the building's usual creaks. I rotated my chair, scanning the empty rows of desks, the vacant chairs tucked neatly beneath their surfaces. The office was quiet, save for the hum of machinery. Ridiculous. My mind was playing tricks, manufacturing phantom sounds from the deep well of my exhaustion. I forced myself to breathe, to push the unsettling sensations away. My rational mind, a fortress built on logic and empirical evidence, demanded an explanation. Stress. That was it. The estate, with its decaying grandeur and obscure family secrets, was a considerable undertaking, an unwelcome inheritance that had stirred up more dust than I'd anticipated. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, a low, sibilant murmur, just beyond the grasp of comprehension. My collection of antique globes, usually pristine and undisturbed on their shelf, seemed to have shifted. A small, brass armillary sphere, which I habitually kept facing north, was now askew, its delicate rings angled towards the window. I stared at it, a knot tightening in my stomach. I lived alone. There was no one else. Night brought no respite. My dreams, usually a quiet procession of historical figures and geographic anomalies, transformed into vivid, unsettling tapestries. The floors would shift beneath my feet, revealing glimpses of churning soil, and I would wake with a gasp, the taste of dust on my tongue, the phantom sensation of roots entangling my ankles. Each morning, the memory of these nocturnal journeys lingered, a sour aftertaste that clung to my waking hours. The map. Always, it drew me back. I unrolled it across my drafting table, the rough parchment rustling like dry skin. I had spent hours verifying its known points, comparing its crude topography to modern surveys. Yet, as the days blurred into a week, I began to notice subtle distortions. It wasn't there before, I was certain. My meticulous memory, a professional asset, screamed dissent. I leaned closer, my magnifying glass hovering, but the line seemed to shimmer, refusing to resolve into a definitive mark. It was as if the very fibers of the parchment were realigning themselves, expressing a hidden geometry. Then came the true shift. And beneath them, where I remembered only blank space, a faint, rust-colored stain began to spread. It was not a stain on the paper, but of the paper, as if the very material was bleeding from within. The shape was indistinct, an amorphous blot that pulsed with an unsettling, organic quality. My breath caught in my throat. This was no trick of the light, no fatigue-induced hallucination. The map, my anchor to the rational world, was betraying me. It was changing, revealing something new, something disturbing, something that defied the very laws of cartography and reason. The meticulous lines I had cherished, the ordered world I had built for myself, began to fray at the edges, pulled apart by this silent, insidious transformation. My logical facade, once so solid, now felt like a crumbling wall against an insistent, unseen tide. Doubt, a corrosive acid, was beginning its slow, undeniable work. The estate was not merely pulling me back, it was reaching out, its ancient tendrils seeking purchase in the very fabric of my reality. My colleagues, distant murmurs behind the fabric walls, moved through their day, oblivious to the chasm that had opened beneath my own. My hands, usually steady, trembled faintly above the keyboard, refusing to engage with the familiar, safe work. The estate, even from this remove, clung to me like a shroud woven from cold mist in ancient soil. It demanded my attention, a silent, persistent whisper in the quiet chambers of my mind. My screen, a portal meant for contour lines and elevation markers, instead glowed with the stark, unsettling history of my own lineage. I had begun to dig, driven by a desperate, gnawing need to understand what the map had hinted at, what the land itself seemed to promise and threaten. I started with the digitized archives of the Regional Historical Society, then moved to obscure genealogical forums, cross-referencing names and dates. The fluorescent light above my cubicle cast a harsh, unwavering glare, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air, yet it did little to dispel the growing shadows within me. I found the first mention, a brief, almost dismissive note in a 19th-century county record, the proprietor, a Mr. Elias Reid, having exhibited signs of severe melancholia and an unhealthy fixation upon the northern reaches of his property, was removed from public duties. Melancholia. A polite euphemism, I suspected, for something far more consuming. As I delved deeper, the individual threads began to weave into a tapestry of quiet horror. A collection of scanned letters, exchanged between my great-great-aunt and a distant cousin, spoke in veiled terms of the family affliction and the burden of the soil. They referenced the peculiar quietness that would descend upon certain family members, a withdrawal that often preceded a more profound, disturbing change. The northern reaches mentioned in the county record, the areas my great-granduncle had wandered, they corresponded precisely with the blank, undelineated spaces on my inherited map. One particular legend spoke of the hungry earth that occasionally claimed its due, a euphemism for disappearances that had become a recurring, unsettling motif. Each discovery was a fresh splinter of ice in my heart. The peculiar quietness of my ancestors, their unhealthy fixation, the hungry earth, these weren't isolated incidents. The map, I realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just a guide to hidden features. It was a key, a diagram of vulnerabilities, perhaps even a blueprint for the malevolent force that had preyed upon my family for generations. The distant clatter of a printer sounded like bones rattling. The muffled ring of a phone became a spectral chime. The stale air grew heavy, thick with the unsaid, the unspoken horrors I was uncovering. My eyes returned to the map, specifically to the areas where the old journals and folklore converged. These were not just locations, they were anchors, points of ingress or perhaps, points of sacrifice. The incomplete lines on my map were not merely missing data, they were veiled warnings, deliberate omissions designed to hide something terrible. My gaze, tethered by an invisible thread, kept snagging on the map printout pinned to the bland partition before me. The blank spaces were no longer mere omissions, they were voids, hungry and waiting. A flicker. Just at the periphery of my vision, where the muted gray of the cubicle wall met the antiseptic white of the ceiling tile, a shadow detached itself from nothing and coalesced into a fleeting, skeletal distortion. It lingered for less than a breath, a ripple in the air that no one else could possibly have seen, then dissolved. My breath hitched, a knot tightening in my chest. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, attributing it to strain, to exhaustion, to anything but what my gut screamed it was. At first, they were indistinct, a rustling like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten graveyard, just beyond the threshold of hearing. I strained, leaning forward, trying to separate them from the general office din, the keyboard clatter, the distant murmur of a supervisor's phone call, the whine of the coffee machine. But they were not external. They were inside, or so close to inside my mind that the distinction blurred. Everything all right? A colleague, a genial man who usually occupied the cubicle opposite, paused beside my partition. I startled, my hand flying to my chest. Yes, fine. Just lost in thought. I forced a smile, but my jaw felt stiff, my lips reluctant to cooperate. He nodded, oblivious, and moved on. It yearns. My hand, trembling, reached for the ceramic mug on my desk. Just as my fingers brushed the handle, the mug slid, slow and deliberate, a full inch across the polished surface of the desk before clattering against the cubicle wall. Not a bump, not a tremor. A push. My eyes darted around, searching for an explanation, a draft, a vibration, anything. There was nothing. The mug sat innocently, a silent accusation. This wasn't just in the estate. This was here, now, following me. I needed to talk to someone, to articulate the impossible. I found the colleague by the water cooler, fiddling with a leaky dispenser. I, at the estate. And now here. He turned, a faint frown creasing his brow. Reid, you look like you haven't slept in weeks. That old house getting to you? Inheriting a place like that can be a lot. He offered a sympathetic, if weary, smile. Maybe you need a break. He listened patiently, nodding, but his eyes held that familiar, dismissive pity. Look, I get it. Stress. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional. No one would believe me. No one could believe me. The estate called to me then, a low, insistent thrum beneath the din of the city. I left work early, the unspoken accusation of my colleague's gaze burning into my back. The drive back felt shorter than usual, the landscape blurring into an indistinct rush. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. It seeks. It finds. The blood calls. In the study, the map, now spread across the ancient oak table, seemed to pulse faintly under the lamplight. A loud crack echoed from the drawing room. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The large ornate mirror, a family heirloom, now had a jagged fissure running through its silvered surface, as if struck by an invisible fist. Then came the sound, from directly beneath my feet. A wet, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across rough stone, followed by a faint, rhythmic thud. It emanated from the floorboards directly below a specific, unmarked spot on the map, a small, circular indentation I had always dismissed as an ink blot or a flaw in the parchment. Now, the indentation seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light, a sickly green pulse that beat in time with the thudding from below. The sounds were clearer now, the wet scrape, the heavy thud, and beneath it all, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards, through my very bones. It was alive. Something was alive, and imprisoned, directly beneath this very spot. Frantically, I pulled out my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. The local constable, a distant relative, even the colleague who thought I was mad. I dialed, but the screen flickered, the signal bars dissolving into nothingness. No service. I tried again, and again, but the words mocked me. You are here, Reid. You are ours. And the debt. It began to coalesce, to thicken, forming an indistinct, towering silhouette that filled the space between the bookshelf and the mantelpiece. It had no discernible features, yet I felt its gaze, a burning, ancient malice that pierced through me. I was utterly, irrevocably alone, trapped within these walls, with something ancient and terrible stirring beneath my feet, demanding its due. And I, Reid, was the chosen vessel for its terrifying reawakening. The swirling darkness had no features, yet it held a gaze, a weight that pressed upon my very bones. Then, an abrupt wrench, a sudden plummet into a silence so profound it was a physical blow. I jolted upright, a gasp catching in my throat, only to find myself sprawled on a floor that was not my study's worn timber. The air, heavy and stagnant, tasted of stale coffee and something acrid, metallic, like burned circuitry. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a ghost of the vortex's suction. Above me, a grid of fluorescent lights hummed, an incessant, irritating whine that seemed to bore directly into my skull. Their flat, sickly glow bleached the world in shades of gray and pallid yellow. Identical, chest-high partitions, upholstered in drab, pilled fabric, formed an army of sterile cells, each a mirror image of the last. Empty chairs, their plastic wheels locked in place, faced dormant computer screens that reflected the unblinking lights. No movement, no sound beyond the persistent hum, no other presence. It was an echoing mausoleum of forgotten routines, a purgatorial space where time itself seemed to have stalled. How had I arrived here? My hand instinctively clutched at the crumpled parchment I held, the deciphered fragment from the estate's hidden texts, the one I'd been working on before. My eyes, still adjusting to the brutal monotony of the cubicle farm, scanned the ancient script, its symbols now disturbingly clear. The fluorescent glare, so offensive to the eye, paradoxically sharpened the lines, illuminated the intricate connections I had missed in the flickering lamplight of the study. The text spoke not of land boundaries or forgotten treasure, as I had initially hoped, but of a binding. The strange, almost organic lines I had dismissed as decorative flourishes, the concentric circles that defied conventional surveying, they were not features on the land, but of the land itself. They were the sinews of the tether, the invisible architecture of a prison. The map wasn't pointing to something to be found, but to something contained. My breath hitched. The hidden features I had so diligently sought, the ancient secrets that had fueled my obsession, were not benevolent. The map was a blueprint of a cage, and the estate, my inherited land, was its lock. They were the straining of the tether, the rustling of a colossal, unseen occupant against the weakening bars of its confinement. The text spoke of the line, a lineage chosen, or perhaps cursed, to maintain the seal. My blood, my family name, my very presence here, was not a coincidence. I had been drawn back, not by mere inheritance, but by a deeper, older summons. Was I meant to reinforce the weakening prison, to complete the map and strengthen the binding? Or, God help me, had I been lured here, an unwitting key, to finally release it? It was primordial, a force of such ancient malevolence that it had required an entire estate, an entire bloodline, to keep it from the world. And I, Reid, the meticulous cartographer, had been meticulously, inexorably, drawn into its orbit. The map, now a terrifying prophecy, was incomplete. The seal was weakening. It had been calling. It was calling. And I was standing, lost and alone, on the precipice of its awakening. The fluorescent hum of the cubicle farm seemed to amplify, becoming a deafening roar in my mind, a premonition of the unspeakable sound of a breaking seal. I had to get back. I had to understand what I had done. The sudden plummet into silence had been a physical blow, a wrench that had torn me from my study, from the swirling void. I jolted upright, a gasp catching in my throat, my lungs burning with air I hadn't realized I'd been denied. My hands, clammy and trembling, flattened against a surface that was not the polished oak of my floorboards, but a thin, rough carpet, smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. My eyes, still swimming with the phantom afterglow of impossible darkness, struggled to focus. Above, an array of fluorescent lights hummed with a low, insidious drone, casting an unforgiving, sterile glare across an endless grid of beige fabric walls. This was not a dream. How? How could I be here? One moment, the estate's secrets threatened to consume me in my study, the next, this antiseptic purgatory. This was no mere hallucination. This was an act, a deliberate translocation, a demonstration of power beyond anything I had conceived. It was not a sound I heard with my ears, but a direct intrusion, a thought planted, foreign yet utterly clear. You are mine, Reid. The land is mine." The voice, if one could call it that, was devoid of inflection, yet it pulsed with an ancient, predatory hunger. It knew my name. It knew my lineage. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles stiff and uncooperative, my head throbbing with a dull ache. My gaze swept across the rows of empty cubicles, searching for a source, a physical manifestation. There was nothing. Come, Reid. Embrace the gift. Return to the earth. It carried with it a seductive promise of oblivion, a release from the gnawing fear, a cessation of all struggle. I clenched my fists, digging my fingernails into my palms. My determination, though frayed, flared. I would not yield. This entity, this thing beneath the estate, had toyed with me, haunted my waking hours, invaded my dreams. Now, it sought to claim me entirely. As I resisted the insidious pull, a different kind of clarity pierced through the mental assault. The map. The incomplete map, the one with the strange, almost ritualistic symbols around the periphery of the buried feature. They were not decorative. They were a lock. And within that lock, a sequence. A specific order of activation, a countermeasure, woven into the very geometry of the land. Not a physical barrier, but a resonant frequency, a binding spell of earth and will. The old texts, the obscure marginalia I'd painstakingly translated, suddenly coalesced into a coherent whole. A ritual of resealing. A way to bind the entity back to its slumber, to sever its connection to the living world. The ritual was not merely a recitation of words, nor the drawing of lines. It demanded a profound personal sacrifice. It wasn't about giving up something material, or even a part of my body. It required a severing. It would bind me to the land, not in death, but in a profound, internal sacrifice that would leave me forever altered, diminished, a living echo of the land's silent guardian. The stakes, suddenly, were terrifyingly clear. It was not just my sanity, not just my life, but the very essence of who I was. And beyond that, the fate of the land, perhaps even the delicate veil between worlds, hinged on my decision. I would fight, but the cost. The cost would be everything. I scrambled, yes, but not in retreat. The terror, sharp and visceral, had pierced through the last vestiges of my denial, leaving behind a cold, unyielding resolve. There was no turning back, no escape from this twisted inheritance. The map, my life's work, had become my doom, and now, perhaps, my only weapon. My hands, though trembling, moved with a meticulous precision born of desperation. I laid out the fragments of the deciphered ritual, the arcane symbols and chilling instructions that had, until now, seemed like an academic curiosity, a dark footnote in my family's history. The final coordinates, scrawled in an ancient hand on a parchment brittle as autumn leaves, pointed to a point deep beneath the oldest wing of the estate, a place the map only hinted at with a single, ominous glyph, a jagged tear in the fabric of the earth. A crypt, a forgotten chamber, something far older than the stones above. I gathered what little I thought might be necessary, a thick coil of rope, a lantern whose beam seemed pitifully frail against the encroaching gloom, a heavy iron bar for leverage. It was a premonition, a thrumming chord struck by the entity itself, signaling its awareness of my intent. The descent began in the cellar, a familiar space that now seemed to writhe with a nascent malevolence. The stone steps, usually cool and firm, felt slick beneath my boots, as if weeping a thin, viscous film. A section of rough-hewn rock slid inward with a groan that echoed like a dying breath, revealing a vertical shaft plunging into absolute blackness. I secured the rope, testing its purchase with a grim set to my jaw. Then, the world warped. The raw rock vanished, replaced by the bland, uniform gray of fabric-covered partitions. My feet, which had been seeking purchase on unseen ledges, now stood on a surprisingly firm, carpeted floor. I blinked, my mind reeling. I was no longer in a subterranean shaft. The change was instantaneous, absolute, and profoundly wrong. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly, anemic glow over endless rows of identical workstations. The air hung thick with the ghosts of burnt coffee, stale toner, and a pervasive, chemical cleanliness that made my throat ache. My lantern, still clutched in my hand, cast a pathetic, yellow circle on the industrial carpet, utterly out of place. There were no people, no busy murmurs, no clatter of keyboards. Each cubicle was empty, yet not entirely so. A forgotten pen lay askew on a desk, a crumpled paper coffee cup sat by a monitor, a chair was slightly askew as if its occupant had just stepped away. It was the entity's voice, now subtly altered, filtered through the mundane horror of this impossible space. You seek an end. There is no end, only continuation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was an illusion, a trap for my mind. It had to be. My cartographer's logic screamed at the impossibility. Ancestral estate. Hidden crypt. Not this, not this. Each turn led to another identical corridor, another empty workstation. The flickering lights pulsed in time with my mounting panic, and the hum intensified, burrowing into my skull. This is your truth, the voice hissed, closer now, seeming to emanate from the very walls of the cubicles. Endless, meaningless repetition. The entity was not merely showing me an illusion, it was twisting my own fears, my own professional anxieties, against me. I forced myself to remember the glyph, the ancient coordinates, the true path. When I opened my eyes, the flickering fluorescents were gone. The gray cubicles dissolved like smoke. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. The illusion had been potent, a brief, horrifying detour into a manufactured purgatory. But I had pushed through. My resolve, though shaken, had not broken. The entity had shown me its psychological arsenal, and I had endured. Below me, the lantern's beam now revealed a vast, cavernous space, a gaping maw in the earth. The rope stretched taut, and I could dimly perceive a floor far, far below. This was it. The true descent. The entity had failed to turn me back with its mental games. Now, I knew, the physical trials would begin. The air grew heavier still, laden with an ancient, predatory hunger. Small and hollow in the vastness the entity had conjured. The sterile observations, the cold, unfeeling precision it accused me of, it was a mirror held up to my deepest fears. Then, the world shifted. Not a gentle fade, but a violent, sickening lurch, as if the very fabric of reality had been ripped and restitched in haste. The rough-hewn stone walls dissolved, giving way to endless vistas of muted gray. Rows upon rows of identical partitions stretched into a hazy distance, their tops barely reaching my chest. The floor, covered in a thin, worn carpet, felt oddly spongy beneath my boots. My skin crawled. This was the entity's retort, its ultimate weapon, to trap me in the antithesis of everything I held sacred, the wild, the ancient, the map. You seek order, a voice slithered, not from any discernible point. From the very air, from the flickering lights, from the rustle of unseen papers. It was the entity, its presence now diffused, encompassing, suffocating. You crave lines, boundaries, the comfort of the known. But here, Reid, there is only the unmapped. The endless, the indistinguishable. What good is your compass in a desert of identical gray? My breath hitched. My cartographer's mind, so accustomed to finding patterns, to imposing structure on chaos, recoiled. Every cubicle was a cell, every row a dead end. This was a spatial prison, designed to break my will by denying me any point of reference. My gaze darted around, searching for a landmark, a unique feature, anything to grasp onto. There was nothing. Just the relentless, soul-crushing uniformity. A wave of nausea washed over me. The entity was not just showing me this, it was making me feel the crushing weight of its emptiness, the despair of a world devoid of meaning. It was trying to convince me that my maps, my life's work, were ultimately futile, mere scratchings on an insignificant surface. It wanted me to surrender to the formless, to become as bland and indistinct as these cubicle walls. No, I rasped, the word a desperate anchor. My hand instinctively went to the satchel slung across my shoulder, my fingers brushing against the rolled ancestral map within. It was still there. A spark ignited in the gloom within me. The map. The true map. It wasn't just about the estate's physical layout, it was about its metaphysical one. I pulled it out, unrolling it with trembling hands on the nearest cubicle top. The aged parchment, with its intricate lines and forgotten symbols, seemed impossibly vibrant against the drab background. The entity's voice sharpened, a hiss of annoyance. A child's drawing. A quaint delusion. You cannot chart the infinite, Reid. You cannot cage what has no form. You have form, I countered, my voice gaining strength, my mind beginning to hum with a forgotten purpose. You have boundaries. You are tied to the land, to the lines I found. The ley lines. The hidden conduits. The map revealed them, even if you tried to obscure them. My eyes scanned the ancient document, my fingers tracing the faint, almost invisible symbols I had painstakingly uncovered. The entity had tried to hide them, to make them seem like incidental flourishes, but they weren't. They were a language. A containment. A ritual. I remembered the specific configuration of the 4 standing stones, the specific angle of the creek's bend, the precise alignment of the constellation depicted in the corner of the map on a particular night. It wasn't just about where things were, but how they related. The map wasn't just a representation, it was a key. The entity's presence intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. You are insignificant. Your knowledge is a speck against eternity. But a new resolve hardened within me. A series of small, interlocking geometric patterns, almost like a fractal, repeated at crucial junctions. They were not just symbols, they were seals. And one specific pattern, at the very heart of the property, was incomplete. It needed a final stroke, a final connection. This sterile, uniform landscape. It was designed to break me, but it also offered a terrifying opportunity. If the entity was trying to make me believe in the unmapped, then I would map it. I would use its own prison against it. My gaze fell upon a stack of pristine and used printer paper on a nearby desk. And a pen, a cheap ballpoint, still attached to a plastic chain. Crude, but functional. This space is a boundary. The specific geometric pattern, the one from the map, the one that represented containment. I didn't just draw it, I imbued it with intent, with every ounce of my will. The entity shrieked, a sound that ripped through the air, vibrating the cubicle walls. The lights exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the immediate area into a deeper gloom, but I kept drawing, the faint glow of my own determination illuminating the page. The entity lashed out. I stumbled, my head hitting a cubicle partition with a sickening thud. Pain flared, but I gripped the pen tighter. I was a cartographer. I understood lines. I understood power in geometry. I crawled to the next cubicle, my fingers smearing sweat and a trickle of blood onto the paper. I replicated the pattern, connecting it, extending it. The map was a ritual. The act of drawing, of mapping, was the ritual. Reid, it hissed, its voice now a multitude of voices, all mocking, all despairing. You are already lost. No, I gasped. Pushing myself up. I am finding my way. I am drawing the way out. I moved from cubicle to cubicle, from desk to desk, using every available surface. The cubicle walls became my parchment, the floor my canvas. I was mapping the entity, defining its boundaries, drawing the ancient seals onto this modern, sterile prison. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost tangible pressure. The entity was fighting, manifesting its resistance as crushing despair, as physical exhaustion. My muscles screamed, my head throbbed, but I pushed through. The final connection. The last line of the geometric seal. It was the crucial point, the linchpin. I found a whiteboard, stark white against the gray, and with a dry erase marker I found clattering in a tray, I began to complete the final pattern. The entity roared, a sound that vibrated through my bones, attempting to shatter my resolve. Every stroke was precise, every line deliberate. I felt a surge of energy, not my own, but from the land itself, from the true map, flowing into my hand, guiding the marker. The ancient knowledge, the true cartography, was asserting itself. With a final, trembling hand, I completed the last line. A blinding flash of light erupted from the whiteboard, not a harsh, electrical burst, but a pure, clean light that pulsed with an ancient, resonant power. The roar of the entity was cut short, replaced by a sound of pure, unadulterated containment. A sound like a vast, unseen lock clicking into place. The light faded. The flickering light stabilized, casting a dull, even glow. The air was still, silent, save for my own ragged breathing. I had done it. I had contained it. But the cost. I looked at my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably, not from exhaustion, but from a deeper tremor. The world, through my eyes, was subtly altered. The lines of the cubicles, the edges of the desks, the very air itself. The ritual had imprinted something on me, or perhaps, it had opened something within me. I could see the hidden lines now, the unseen conduits, the geometric patterns that underpin reality, flickering just beneath the surface of everything. The world was no longer merely a collection of objects, it was a vast, intricate, terrifyingly alive map, and I was perpetually trapped within its ever-unfolding, visible geometries. The entity was gone, but it had left its mark. I was no longer merely a cartographer of the known, I was a cartographer of the unseen, and the burden of that sight was a heavy, suffocating shroud. The hum ceased. Not faded, not died, but simply ceased. One moment, its oppressive thrum had filled the air, a physical weight on my skull, a buzzing in my teeth, and the next, only a vast, echoing silence remained. My hand, still clenched around a charcoal stick, hung suspended over a sprawling, hastily drawn glyph etched into a cubicle wall. My breath hitched, a ragged rasp in the profound stillness. The air, thick moments ago with an almost palpable presence, felt thin and empty, like a void where something immense had just been torn away. I tried to move, but my limbs felt weighted with lead, each muscle a knot of agony. A dull ache throbbed behind my eyes, and my throat was raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours. Perhaps I had. I couldn't remember. I pushed myself away from the cubicle wall, my back protesting with a sharp, searing pain. I ran my fingers over my face, finding the coarse stubble of days unshaven, the grit of dust, and the unsettling stickiness of dried tears. My eyes, when I finally forced them open fully, felt like sandpaper, burning with exhaustion. Every partition, every desk, every inch of the linoleum floor was covered in my frenzied cartography. Lines intersected, symbols intertwined, ancient seals overlapped modern grid patterns. It was a map of containment, a cage built of ink and intention. But it was also a ruin. Papers lay scattered, overturned chairs formed barricades, and in several places, the very structure of the cubicle walls seemed to have buckled inwards, as if struck by an invisible, crushing force. A faint, acrid smell, like burnt earth and ozone, still clung to the air, a phantom limb of the entity's presence. I looked down at my hands. My skin was pallid, almost translucent, and beneath the dirt and grime, a network of faint, bluish lines seemed to pulse just beneath the surface, tracing paths that mirrored the very seals I had drawn. A fragment, perhaps. A terrible, indelible signature left behind. I was alone. Truly alone. The outside world, oblivious to the monstrous struggle that had just transpired within these sterile walls, began to stir. Faintly, through the double-paned windows, I could hear the distant murmur of early morning traffic, the chirping of unseen birds, the first tentative breaths of a city waking up. They knew nothing. They would never know. A wave of nausea washed over me, a sickening lurch that had nothing to do with my physical state. It was a recoil from the knowledge I now carried, a burden heavier than any physical injury. I had seen it, felt it, battled it, and in doing so, I had become something else. My mind, once a meticulous archive of historical data and geographical precision, was now a fractured landscape, adorned with grotesque memories and visions that flickered at the periphery of my awareness. My gaze fell upon a discarded pen, its ink cartridge depleted, its plastic casing scored with my desperate grip. I picked it up, feeling the familiar weight, yet it felt alien in my scarred fingers. The cartographer in me, the precise, analytical part, was still there, but it was now overlaid with something ancient, something primal. I had faced it. I had survived. But what had survived of me? The question hung in the air, a silent, terrifying promise of what was yet to come. The cost of victory was not just ruin, but an irrevocable transformation, a new map etched onto my very soul. The hum had ceased. Its departure was not a retreat, but an excision, a sudden, brutal severing that left a vacuum in its wake. My hand, still clenched around the charcoal stick, lingered above the parchment, a tremor running through the bone and muscle. The last line, jagged and final, had been drawn. The map, now complete, lay before me, an intricate web of lines and symbols, each stroke a testament to the buried thing, each mark a fragment of its terrible truth. And then, only silence. I did not remember leaving the estate. The days that followed were a blur of cold air and the taste of ash on my tongue, of hands that felt not quite my own, moving with a purpose born of exhaustion and a strange, quiet dread. The gates, I recalled, had been secured. The estate, my inheritance, now a tomb, its ancient secrets locked away beneath the earth and the carefully completed map. My fingers, once deft with the delicate tools of a cartographer, now felt clumsy, swollen with an invisible burden. A colleague, a man whose name I could not quite recall, paused by my cubicle. "Reid," he began, his voice a muffled drone through the fabric partitions. "Good to have you back. Everything all right?" I nodded, a movement that felt disconnected from my will. My gaze drifted past him, over the identical screens, the neat stacks of paper, the framed motivational posters. They were all so thin, so utterly superficial. How could they not feel the immense, crushing weight of what lay beneath? It was the scent of the estate, of the subterranean chambers, of the thing I had mapped and, in doing so, had bound. Or perhaps, had been bound to. My work, the meticulous charting of ancient trade routes, of forgotten coastlines, now seemed like child's play. My maps, once sources of pride, felt like pretty lies. I saw not just the lines of rivers and mountains, but the invisible currents beneath them, the hidden arteries of the world, throbbing with something ancient and indifferent. Every contour held a secret, every blank space a potential horror. My cartographer's eye, once a gift, had become a curse, seeing too much, too deeply. I would lie awake, listening to the rhythmic drip of a faulty faucet, the distant wail of a siren, and transpose them into the throbbing of the earth, the slow, deliberate pulse of something immense stirring in its sleep. I would imagine the completed map, not on parchment, but etched into the very bedrock beneath the estate, a permanent tattoo on the land itself. And I, its unwitting keeper. The entity was contained. But the cessation had come at a cost. I had not merely mapped the thing, I had completed it, becoming an integral, if unwilling, part of its terrible design. It was a call, not urgent, but patient. A reminder. The map was complete. The thing was contained. I was no longer just Reid, the cartographer.